May 16th, 2021. We're getting close to halfway through this year. It's hard to believe how quickly this year has passed and how long the year before was. You know, things have been getting better. The pandemic continues. We continue to have thousands of people infected each day across the country, but the deaths are far fewer than they've been. And this week we got some new guidelines from the CDC, which I think all of us were happy to hear. And those guidelines include the fact that if we've been fully vaccinated and we're around people that are fully vaccinated, then we no longer have to wear these awful masks. And we no longer have to socially distance, and that's true inside or outside. So that's going to change a lot of things about the way we operate. And of course, here at Park Place, each individual facility has to make its own decision. And here at Park Place, so far, we're still required to wear the mask and socially distance. But I anticipate that that will be changing pretty soon in the coming weeks as the situation continues and is to improve and as more and more people are vaccinated. You know, there are a lot of things about the long-term impact of this pandemic that are really unknown. We know that business travel has changed forever. People have learned that they don't have to go to Tokyo to have a meeting in Tokyo. They can do it from their home or they can do it from their office, either one. And so we know the business travel industry is going to be greatly affected. The automobile industry is affected. There's a shortage of new cars now because they've not been able to get all the components they need, because some of the areas where components are made have been unable to work for so many months. One thing that I thought of that has been impacted is the sale of shoes. Now, you may not have thought about that, but I get 2 or 3 emails every day from shoes.com wanting to sell me shoes. Now, why is that? I think I know the reason is because for the last 20 years, I've bought 1 or 2 pairs of shoes from shoes.com online, but I haven't had to buy any new shoes for over a year. Why is that? Because when you're working at home, at least me, I don't typically wear shoes. So that's another industry that's been affected by this that we may not have thought about, shoe sales. That's one, though, that as we get back to more normal things, will return, and that industry will come back and hopefully won't be hurt too bad. But that's one of the strange things that from this pandemic. Sports are gradually returning to normal. Our professional sports are still some bumps along the road. We're starting to allow the stadiums to open up more and more. Some of them have been 10 and 20%. They're now going to 50%. And in the next couple of months, they'll probably be up to 100% as more and more people are vaccinated. And this has so much been thanks to the vaccinations that have been developed. And that's interesting because how our science and our leaders have worked to have these vaccines created. And of course, they use the talents that God has given them. They use the skills and the knowledge that they've given to develop these. And I think it's been God-driven, because these vaccines that have been created and developed for us normally would take 5 to 10 years, and they've been done in a very short period of time. And that's fortunate for us, and we need to thank God for that. But in these past months, the role of our government has often been questioned. Are we doing too much? Are we doing too little? Whether you're far to the left or far to the right, you can criticize what's going on with the way we're handling the pandemic and everything else for that matter, and the way we've dealt with it. And it's even impacted our churches. That's become a political issue, whether we can meet or not. Just like us here, that we're having to meet in the dining room instead of the chapel because of the pandemic. And some people, there are a lot of different ways to look at that. And there's some churches that have refused to follow the guidelines and have continued to meet. And it's been a political issue as to what rules of our government we should follow and how that should all work and what we should and shouldn't do. What if our government were to decide that, for the past year and a half, people have worshiped online, that's worked pretty well. Why don't we just say no more church attendance? Can you imagine if our government said, you just can't go to church anymore, we don't need that. You can worship online, you can make your contributions online, you can support good works around the world, you can do all that online, you don't need to meet in person. Obviously, that's ridiculous. Now, we could accept it as a short-term issue to deal with this crisis, but long-term, that would be completely unacceptable. Or worse, what if we were ordered to bow down and worship some sort of an idol? Can you imagine that? Think about our country. Can you imagine if we were being forced or ordered to do that by our government? Well, that has happened in the past. Not in the United States. As you know, our country was really founded in large part because of the desire to have religious freedom. Diverse religions were accepted in our country. People came from Europe because they wanted to practice religion and to worship their God in the way that they saw fit. And that's been a bedrock of our democracy in this country, is the freedom of religion. So we really don't have to worry, I think, about being ordered to worship an idol or being ordered to bow down to some person as being a godlike person. Now, we know of stories in the last century around the world where similar things have happened. But what we're going to talk about today is a story from many centuries ago, before the birth of Christ, and it was at the time of Daniel. Now, everybody's familiar with Daniel, and you know about Daniel and the lion's den and various things about Daniel. But there are a lot of different things in the book of Daniel. And we're going to talk today about the way some of these children of Israel were tested at the time of Daniel. Now, we're going to talk a little about just what the background was. What had happened was, and we're told this in Daniel chapter 1, the king of Judah was Jehoiakim, and he was another bad king. You know, we've talked a few weeks ago about the divided kingdom, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. So Judah had Jerusalem, and Jehoiakim was the king there, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came and besieged the city and overtook Jerusalem, overthrew the government of Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim was no longer the king. In fact, the children of Israel were taken captive, and they were subject to the rule of the Chaldeans, Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar. But it's very interesting, when they took over Jerusalem and took over Judah, they left a lot of the people there, they left a remnant there, but they took what we would call the cream of the crop. They took the smartest people from Jerusalem. This is what we're told in Daniel 1, verse 4. He says, they took captive children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science. They took the best of the best back to Babylon with them. Now, why was that? They wanted to teach them the ways of the Babylonians, and they wanted to integrate them into Babylonian society, and they wanted to use the knowledge and wisdom that they had. Probably, Nebuchadnezzar had probably heard some stories about the children of Israel and how that their God was able to do things that other gods were not able to do. We don't know exactly what the background was for that. Maybe he was trying to develop some sort of a master race. We've certainly heard of that in our lifetimes or in the last 100 years. But whatever it was, these cream of the crop of the children were taken back to Babylon. Now, what he wanted them to be, he wanted them to be fed at the king's table, to eat the king's meat, have the king's wine. He wanted these young Israelites to have the best of everything so they would be physically at their peak to help him run the government of Babylon using their wisdom. Well, Daniel and 3 of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't really want to eat the king's meat. They didn't want to drink the king's wine. They didn't want the king's dainties. They felt bad because their fellow countrymen had been left behind in captivity by the Babylonians. And here they were taken to the palace and being treated like royalty. And they didn't want any part of that. That wasn't fair. It was sort of like, remember Uriah the Hittite, when he was brought back from the battle. He wouldn't go into his wife Bathsheba because of the people that were out fighting the battle. Well, here, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they wanted to continue to worship their God, and they felt that if they took the king's dainties, as they called them, his meat, and drank his wine, that they would be viewed as being just like all the other Babylonians, and they weren't. They were special people because they were part of the children of God. So Daniel proposed a proposition. He made a proposition to the people that were in charge. He said, I know you think that if we eat your food and drink your wine, that that'll make us healthier. But he said, I want us to do a little experiment here. He said, I want you for 10 days to feed me and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego nothing but bread and water. 10 days. And then you compare us to the other young men that are eating at the king's table and see how we look, see how we fare. So they did this, and after 10 days, you know the story, The children of Israel, these four, looked better, were stronger, and healthier than the ones that ate at the king's table. So from then on, they were not required to eat at the king's table. And we're told that Daniel gave counsel to the king and these other three friends of his. And we're told that, listen to this, it says, their advice was 10 times better than Nebuchadnezzar's magicians and astrologers. 10 times better. That's how it was quantified. In other words, they were a lot smarter than the Babylonians. And Nebuchadnezzar recognized this and put them in places of honor. As a matter of fact, these four people were put over all the affairs of Babylon. First Daniel, and then he got his other three friends. They were brought along. So that brings us to today's story. Because here you've got these four children of Israel that are being favored by the king. Well, you can just imagine what that did for the Chaldeans. For those people in Babylonia that saw these Jews that were put over them, obviously they were jealous, and they looked for ways to bring them down because they wanted to be in charge. They didn't want to be subject to this bunch of Jews that were there. So they came up with some ideas. So listen to this, Daniel 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. And he set it up in the province of Babylon. And then he sent together the princes, governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces were to come to the dedication of this golden image which the king has set up. And then all of these people stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up at the dedication and worshipped it. And in a heralded cry aloud, they were told, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the music, they fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. But there were certain of the Chaldeans that came near and accused the Jews. And they said to the king, "O king, you live forever. You've made a decree that when the music sounds that you're to fall down and worship the golden image. And if you're not doing that, you're supposed to be cast into the fiery furnace." They said, "But there are certain Jews that you set over the affairs of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Now, we don't know where Daniel was in this time. He may have been out of the country. Who knows what he was doing? He may have been doing some mission for the king. But he was not here at this time. But the people saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the leaders of the provinces, that they did not bow down to that golden image. Well, Nebuchadnezzar liked the children of Israel. He was happy with them and the advice they gave. But at the end of the day, these were people he'd captured. These were his captives. And for them not to obey his rules and his laws, that was a horrible thing to him. So here's what he said. It said, he was furious, and he commanded that they bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before the king. And he said to them, "Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, when you hear the music," he said, "you fall down and worship this golden image. But if you don't, I'm going to cast you the same hour into the midst of a fiery burning furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Now listen to this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, if he doesn't deliver us, be it known unto thee, O God, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up before us." So they said, our God could deliver us from this fiery furnace. But you know what, King? Even if he doesn't, we're willing to die because we know he's the true God. And we're not going to sell ourselves and our God out by worshiping your golden image. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. So he spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more. They got this furnace so much hotter than it had been. And he commanded the most mighty men that they should come in and cast Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. It says these men were bound in their coats and their hats and other garments and were cast in the midst of the fiery burning furnace. But because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame slew the men that took them up and threw them in. So the Babylonians that actually put them, the soldiers that put them in the fiery furnace, all perished. The fire was so hot, but they didn't perish. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and he rose up and spoke and said, didn't we throw these 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the form of the 4th man is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning furnace and spoke and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come forth out of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, captains, counselors, all gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies not a hair was singed. And the fire had no power over them. Their coats weren't even burned. And there was not even the smell of fire on them. And Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything bad about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, because there's no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. This is quite a story of being tested by fire. This is a story of these 3 children of Israel that had so much faith that their God was the true God. And they knew that they might perish. That wasn't really the issue to them. They said, if we perish, we perish. Sort of like what Esther said at a different time when she came forward and saved the children of Israel. She said, if I perish, I perish. They had the same attitude, these 3. And they said, our God can certainly save us if he wants to. We know he's got the power. He's the all-powerful God that created all of us. He created this world. Of course he can save us. But they said he might not. He might not think it's important to save us, these three lowly, Israelites. He doesn't have to save us, but it doesn't matter whether he saves us or not. We're not going to worship a golden image. We're only going to worship the true God. Wow, talk about faith. Now, see, none of us are tested that way. We're not tested that way. Now, there are some people in the world today that are tested. There are several places in the world where people are persecuted for being Christians. And of course, we know that Christians were persecuted at the time of the early church. As a matter of fact, St. Augustine, who was a philosopher and a leader of the church in the early centuries, or about the 3rd or 4th century, said that an unjust law is no law at all. Now think about that. An unjust law is no law at all. Who gets to make that decision? Who gets to decide whether a law is just or unjust? Isn't that a problem that we've faced throughout man's history, I suppose? When there's been tyranny, when there's been oppression, when the governments have tried to suppress the worship of God, how far can Christians go? What is the role of Christians here? And it's a very difficult issue. We've got the teachings of Christ. Christ says, turn the other cheek. But we also know that it's our mission to help spread the gospel and help save souls. So we surely can't just, roll over and allow our lives to be taken when that would give us no more opportunity to help spread the gospel. So this is the situation that was faced here by these children of Israel at the time. And it's a balance that we have to meet in our lives. For example, we're not tested to the sense that if we don't worship a golden calf or golden image or golden idol, that we're going to be cast into a fire. But we are tested every day. We're tested by some of the rules of our government. We have to decide. One of the things that's been so controversial over the last year is, do you need to wear a mask or not? Do you need to be vaccinated or not? It's become a political issue. Both of them have become political issues. And depending on your political persuasion, you're more likely to do one or the other on those issues, which is quite strange because it's a health issue. But nonetheless, those are issues that we faced every day. Do we follow the government guidelines or don't we? Do we say the government doesn't have that power over us? A lot of churches have taken that view. They've been in court cases. They've gone to the United States Supreme Court, which has ruled, and in the case that came before them, the church had the right to worship, even if it did jeopardize the health of their members. There are a lot of balances that have to come forward here. So we're not tested the way these children of Israel were, but we are tested. We have issues that come up for us on a daily basis of what to do and not to do. We have a lot of other laws that we're to follow. Speed limits when we drive on the roads, taxes that we're to pay, so many things that are required of us as citizens. And while it may be true that an unjust law is no law at all, we still are taught by the teachings of the Bible that we are to obey the laws of the land. But then you get to situations like Germany and Hitler and tyranny. Were Christians in Germany supposed to follow the rules of Hitler, knowing that it contradicted the rules of God? Those are things that are important for us to think about. And fortunately, we don't have those ethical issues. We're faced with whether or not to wear a mask. That's pretty simple. Whether or not to socially distance. That's not like whether we're to bow down to a golden idol. But it's the same principle. The law was you had to bow down to a golden idol there. And all the other laws that we have to have. So I think that we can take a lot of solace in the courage of these. But what I take from this story is not just their courage, but their faith. And if they had that kind of faith in God, think of the faith that we should have. We are so much more blessed than they were. We're not faced with this daily challenge. Our faith is not tested by being thrown into a fiery furnace. Our faith is tested by what we believe and how we live our daily lives. Much simpler, but also just as important. So in the coming weeks, remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But when I was growing up, we had a little thing we would do at bedtime. My dad would ask me, say, who was thrown in the fiery furnace? And I would say, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we'd go to bed. And that was just something that we always did. And I always knew their names. Shadrach, Meshach. Now, Abednego and Abednego, that was maybe a little confusing when I was 5 or 6 years old. But that's the story of these three Israelite children and how they showed their faith and their belief in God and how they were rewarded. Let's end with a prayer. Dear God, we come before Thee on this Lord's Day. We praise Your name. Thank You for being our God. Thank You for the progress we've made against this pandemic. Help us that in the coming weeks and months that we can continue to move back toward a sense of normal. Especially, dear God, though, help us to try to have a measure of faith, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Have a measure of faith that You are indeed the true God and that You love us and that You're looking out for us. And no matter how bad things are, help us know that You are indeed God. Thank You for being our God. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Stay safe.